And one example for that would be maybe a Quranic word that has occasioned a comparatively ample stream of interventions, the word Hanif, which I think might serve as a representative study of the sort of problems that come up in Quranic semantics. So in discussing this word Hanif, whose meaning I will try to explicate presently, the 19th and early 20th scholars Wellhausen, Grimm, Noldeke, and Horowitz all acknowledge a verse by the Hudhali poet Abu Du'aib, who died around 649 CE. Read in context, the verse evokes the former abode of the poet's love interest, ar-Rahin, where she used to reside, I quote, in the manner of a Hanif during the 2 months of Jumada and the 2 months of Safar. So these are months of the Arabic or Arab calendar. Now, up until and including Horowitz, scholars only had access to this poetic proof text, which promised to throw light on the Quranic meaning of the word Hanif in the form of a decontextualized quotation from the lexicographical literature, so works like the Lisan al-Arab, pre-modern Arabic dictionaries. And this lack of context generated the conjecture that the female figure who's described as residing in the manner of a Hanif, whatever that might be, is a female camel or a gazelle rather than the poet's beloved. And it was only in 1926 that an edition of the entire poem by Joseph Hell became accessible to European scholars. So after Horowitz has published his Quranische Untersuchung, and read in its literary context, our best guess at the meaning of Hanif in the poem is, I think, that it does refer to a hermit or to a recluse, as Wellhausen maintained against Wellhausen, Noldeke, and Horowitz maintained against Grimm. And the reason for that is that in context, ar-Rahin's abode is envisaged as a sort of solitary idyll where she has erected a tent by a river of fresh water. And in the summer too, she is said to prefer the desert to settled territory on account of the milk of the camels who graze on trees. So this context undermines the view of Grimm, and also more recently, about 18 years ago, of François de Blois, that Hanif means pagan or heathen in this particular poetic proof text. Now, I would accept the conventional claim that the word Hanif is most likely derived from a Syriac word, Hanpo, which means Gentile, heathen. It's a very plausible etymological hypothesis that actually was formulated as early as al-Mas'udi, so an early medieval scholar. So this conjecture did not have to await the advent of comparative Semitics. And this hypothesis is also further corroborated by the fact that there are occurrences of the word Hanif in early Arabic in which it must mean something like heathen, used in opposition to Christian. So it probably is descended from a Syriac word meaning Gentile, heathen. I also think, that's my second premise, that the best translational approximation of how the word Hanif behaves in the Quran is to render it along the lines of wholly devoted to God. The Quran clearly employs the word as an antonym of mushrik, which means somebody who associates or partners other beings with God, illegitimately partners other beings with God. And with all due caution, one might even suggest that the semantics of the word Hanif in the Quran is perhaps tinged by the connotation of inclination or inclining that Islamic lexicographers attribute to the consonantal root that underlies the attribute Hanif. Now, if both of these premises are correct, then at some point in the semantic evolution of the word Hanif, it must have shifted from a pejorative meaning, Gentile, heathen, to a positive one. So how did this happen? What is currently the best, most plausible answer to this question, I would say, is the one that has been devised by François de Blois in the article that I've already referenced. In the Quran, the word Hanif is closely associated with Abraham. And de Blois proposes that the figure of Abraham functioned as a sort of conceptual pivot that facilitated the shift of the word from negative to positive prior to the Quran. And he draws on a passage in Paul's epistle to the Romans, according to which Abraham was considered righteous prior to circumcision. So Abraham was justified not through the law, but through faith, which means that Abraham was righteous already while still being in the state of a Gentile, or as one might say in Quranic Arabic, while being a Hanif. And so perhaps de Blois is correct to posit that some sort of connection with Abraham made it possible for the word Hanif to come to denote religious righteousness, as paradigmatically exemplified by Abraham. And the verse by Abu Du'aib that I've discussed earlier enriches and I think also complicates our understanding of this semantic evolution in interesting ways. The verse is, I think, consistent with the general supposition that in the early 7th century, the word Hanif had come to refer to a person displaying an above average degree of piety or religious commitment. The same holds for another verse by a different author from the same tribe. I will skip that for reasons of time. But I think in this other context too, the meaning of the word Hanif is best approximated by substituting terms like hermit, ascetic, or recluse. In general, my sense is that the figure of the Hanif in Hudali poetry in general is of a piece with other allusions to Christian hermits and holy men in pre-Islamic poetry. That's what the word seems to designate. Now, there's of course no reference to Abraham in these poems, and a conjectured pre-Quranic association of the word Hanif with Abraham doesn't immediately explain how Hanif could have come to mean something like hermit or ascetic in Hudali poetry. I don't at the moment have a better theory than de Blois to explain the semantic inversion that the word must have undergone in pre-Quranic times, but it does seem that a slightly more complicated scenario than the one that he proposes is called for. So we might, for instance, posit that once Hanif had established itself as a descriptor for righteousness, due to its postulated link to the figure of Abraham, the word might then have undergone a further development and taken on the meaning recluse, hermit, ascetic, as attested by Hudali poetry. And perhaps some pre-Islamic speakers of Arabic understood the word in an folk etymologizing sense as somebody who had turned towards God or turned away from society. And then the Quranic use of the word would presumably need to be located on a different branch of its semantic evolution. So it's quite a complicated scenario that I think we probably need to posit in order to account for the entire range of data that is available to us. The Hanif example illustrates not only the, I think, abiding value of older scholarship that is often overlooked and freely downloadable from archive.org in many cases. It also illustrates the value of supplementing a concordential examination of the Quranic corpus with additional bodies of primary sources. And a discursive dictionary of the sort that I'm trying to write, it seems to me, ought to pay significant attention to how a given Quranic word or phrase or its putative antecedent was used in specific pre-Quranic or contemporary texts. And that's of course not to argue that we should simply import the Hudali sense of Hanif into the Quran, just as we cannot evidently simply import the meaning of Syriac Hanpo into the Quranic use of Hanif. Now these supplementary corpora that I've alluded to are not, or should not, I think, be limited to the Bible and to Christian and rabbinic literature, which have all been mined comparatively well, but should also include, I think, early Arabic poetry and Arabian epigraphy. And Quranic scholars, I would submit, need to acquire at least an amateur's acquaintance with these latter two kinds of sources, so poetry and epigraphy. And especially in epigraphy, discoveries are coming out by the day, and sometimes it's really only on Twitter that one finds out, which is a problem for me because I'm not on Twitter. Now, recourse to poetry is a more traditional feature of Quranic scholarship. It's already a prominent feature of the work of Toshihiko Izutsu, and of course it stands in a venerable tradition reaching back to pre-modern Islamic scholarship on the Quran. Poetry has unfortunately fallen somewhat out of favor among contemporary Western students of the Quran due to widespread qualms about its authenticity. I think those scruples are overstated. I can't enter into that in the present context, but I think the very fact that our two Hudali poems use the word Hanif with a semantic slant that's very different from the Quran. They use it in a meaning that doesn't quite fit when you plug it into the Quran. That already illustrates that these proof texts, at least, are not directly dependent on Quranic diction. So in the remainder of my talk, I would like to make two very general observations and maybe flesh them out a bit that have provisionally emerged from my work in Quranic semantics. And neither of those observations is entirely novel, but I think they do bear reiterating. So first, I would stress the need to see the Quran not as some sort of starting point in the semantic history of Arabic, but rather as a milestone along a way that stretches much further back into Arabian late antiquity. My own operating assumption would be that when the Quran is using a certain term or phrase, it is doing so because the term or phrase was sufficiently known to the Quranic audience, in a sense sufficiently close to the one that it has in the Quran.